It's so hard to spot fakes these days, especially with
AI
around
everywhere. So welcome to Enjoy Classical Music's video about classical music fakes.
What is fake, or at least unoriginal, in classical music has a long and rather fascinating history. Of course, in the early days of classical music, there was less need to fake music, as everything was still so relatively fresh. Indeed, when composers copied another composer, it was seen as a sign of respect rather than theft, which reminds me of that old adage, a homage is plagiarism that isn't actionable. Take Bach, who discovered Vivaldi's concerto writing and was so excited about it that he turned more than 15 of Vivaldi's own concertos into works for keyboards and other instruments. But Bach was clear to mention the composer, writing Nach Vivaldi from Vivaldi on the manuscripts that have survived. If there was any actual thievery during the Baroque period, it would tend to be composers stealing from themselves, which happened quite a lot. Or, to give it a greener spin, what you might term recycling. For example, did you know that Bach's Mass in B minor? Only 1/3 of the Mass is original material. For the rest, Bach just reused old material of his own. This is the case with some of the most famous Baroque music.
Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia.
Take Handel's Hallelujah Chorus from his Messiah, an English masterpiece, I hear you say. No, the chorus was in fact reused from his own earlier Italian duet. This process of composers nicking from themselves has happened throughout classical music's history. Oh, is that a tune I recognise coming up? Rossini, who was dreadfully up against it schedule-wise when he was writing the opera, in fact nicked this celebrated overture pretty much note for note from his overture to another opera, Elizabeth of Queen of England, which he'd written a couple of years before The Barber of Seville. And hang on, even that overture wasn't original, as he in fact nicked that from another opera he wrote the year before Elizabeth, Aureliano in Palmyra. In other words, Rossini pilfered his own overture not once, but twice. For the story of famous actual fakes and frauds, may I please introduce you to the Viennese aristocrat Count Walsegg, an amateur musician who had a habit of getting actual composers to write music for him, which he'd then pass off as his own. When Walsegg's wife died, the Count commissioned, in secret, one of Vienna's top composers to write a mass for her, which he could then claim as his own. And that's the reason a masked man was paid to visit Mozart in 1789 to commission a requiem mass. Yes, this is the real story behind Amadeus's bizarre commission. Mozart was of course dying at the time and never knew about Walsegg's involvement, so the whole affair really freaked him out, making him feel, while he was dying, that he was writing the requiem for himself. So, not what you'd describe as a victim-free crime. Mozart died, of course, before he could finish the requiem, so his rather impecunious wife, Constanza, got Mozart's student, Süssmayr, to complete the requiem for Walsegg, who, like the noble aristocrat he no doubt was, rewrote the entire requiem in his own hand and then had it played for the second anniversary of his wife's death, claiming it was his own work. Count Walsegg indeed. Count False-egg, more likely. Count, got you there. While we're on the topic, a couple more very famous pieces that are not actually original. Firstly, which is in fact based on a Spanish song by, excuse my Spanish, Sebastián Radier, called El Arreglito. But allow me to introduce you to an even more famous fake, and one that's fooled me for over 30 years. Albinoni's Adagio is well famous. Look at all these uses in popular culture. Well, it turns out at least a fragment of Albinoni's piece had been found by the violinist Remo Giazzotto in a monastery, and he reworked that fragment into a whole movement which he published in 1958. Only Giazzotto never produced the original fragment, and most scholars now believe the Adagio is Giazzotto's work, not Albinoni's, which means that famous Baroque tune actually hails from the 20th century. But of course Albinoni is far too old and past it to actually sue. However, my favourite story of fake classical music has to be the violinist Fritz Kreisler, probably most famous for having premiered Elgar's violin concerto and helped compose it, and who, at the start of the 20th century, composed a large collection of counterfeit pieces in 17th and 18th century styles, which he played in his own recitals, passing them off as the works of Vivaldi, Couperin and others. He indeed became celebrated as a discoverer of lost classics, claiming to be a kind of musical Indiana Jones, finding manuscripts in monasteries and archives. Kreisler shared the hoax with close friends who kept the secret for many years, with the violinist only coming clean in 1935 on his 60th birthday. Although there was apparently some anger about the revelations, Kreisler pointed out that it should make no difference who wrote the works as long as people enjoyed them. The name changes, the value remains. I'd like to leave you with one more example of fakery that worked in totally the other direction, and indeed might have worked on me. Let me explain. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Berlioz, who claimed that the Shepherd's Farewell from his Christmas piece L'Enfance du Christ was composed by the old French master Pierre Ducret. Only it turned out Berlioz had not only written the piece himself, but had actually made up the composer Ducret entirely. His aim was to catch critics who claimed that Berlioz couldn't write a simple tune. Internet lore says the trap worked, with one critic apparently writing in review of the music, "Berlioz would never be able to write a tune as simple and charming as this little piece by old Ducret," which was of course the cue for Berlioz to reveal the truth. He was the real author, Ducret was the hoax all along, which would go by today as a piece of pretty decent trolling. However, despite searching, and despite using that entire quotation in one of my other videos, I cannot nail the quote to an actual critic. So it turns out that might be fake as well. You just don't know who you can trust anymore.
Please like and subscribe.